Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Washington Post Intelligence Weekly Briefing. Every Friday, we bring together our analysts and thought leaders across industries for a single purpose, to help you get smart fast. I'm Louisa Savage, Editorial Director of Washington Post Intelligence, and if this is your first time joining us, WP Intelligence is a new kind of media. It's built for executives and policymakers who need insight to help them see around corners of policy, industry, and technological trends. Our subscribers receive concise intelligence reports with actionable recommendations across AI and tech, energy and climate, and global security, and now healthcare. We have a graphics library, we produce exclusive interviews, and we give you these live briefings to sort out developments that are changing the business and policy landscape. So today we're looking at cybersecurity. With the accelerated improvement and widening use of AI tools across industries, the very nature of cyber threats has changed. We're going to talk about what those threats look like right now and what leaders of organizations need to know to protect their businesses, their clients, and their employees. We're going to take a lot of questions today because we want to be as useful to you as possible. And to unpack this very high stakes topic, we are joined by two people who have given this a lot of thought. I'd like to introduce Jason Dean, our lead AI and tech analyst, and he's been digging into the changing nature of cybersecurity in the AI age through several in-depth reports. Welcome, Jason.
Hi, Louisa.
And our special guest today is Rex Booth. He is the Chief Information Security Officer at SailPoint. And that's a company that manages identity security for businesses and government agencies. They manage tens of millions of identities across thousands of customers in more than 100 countries. Not only that, but Rex has previously helped stand up the White House's Office of the National Cyber Director. And before that, he was a senior advisor at the Department of Homeland Security's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, known as CISO. And Rex is also a member of our Washington Post Intelligence AI and Tech Council. So thank you so much, Rex, for joining us and sharing all the depth of your experience and expertise.
Yeah, thanks, Louisa. Glad to be here.
Well, great. So here's how we're going to organize our conversation for the next hour. First, we're going to talk about the emerging threats from AI and how they differ from traditional cybersecurity threats. Once we scare ourselves, we're going to talk about some of the defensive countermeasures that organizations and their leaders can take. And thirdly, we'll discuss what role public policy can play in helping keep our cyber defenses strong. And lastly, we'll also discuss, well, not lastly, throughout the conversation, we'll discuss how business leaders and policymakers should be navigating this very historic moment. And I'd also like to thank our audience for the truly excellent questions that you've already sent in ahead of the briefing, and we've used them to help shape the conversation. And throughout the conversation, I invite you all to please drop your questions in the chat. I have an iPad here, and we will be taking relevant questions as we go along. So without further ado, let's get into it. Jason, you wrote a report for WP Intelligence called The Executive's Guide to AI Security Risks. And you really dove into the ways that AI is swiftly and quite alarmingly changing the risks that organizations face. So can you just give us at high level, where are we right now?
Yeah, I think both in terms of the threat and the opportunity, we're at an important historical moment. Prominent security experts are warning about a new era of AI-enabled attacks that are much faster and automated, more automated than attacks have been in the past. Potentially more sophisticated, though we're not necessarily seeing that yet. But just the speed and scope that are dramatically increased. And then also people saying like this is potentially a really good opportunity. We spoke with Jen Easterly, who's the former director of CISO, who called this the most exciting moment in the history of cybersecurity because she thinks that there's the potential to use this, and we can talk about this later, to use AI to really plug a lot of the security holes in software that have been plaguing us with problems for decades.
Mm-hmm. I want to sort of focus in for 1 second on something that really struck me in reading your report. We think about cybersecurity risks of AI, and we think of the AI companies themselves. But in reading your report, it was really clear that this is like a very widespread issue because of how widespread the adoption has become of AI, even outside the AI sector itself, and what that means for the risk of cyber attacks. So I just wanted to put on screen one chart that was in your report. Talk us through who's using AI and how widespread the risks are.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably not a surprise to say that the generative AI's takeoff has really been faster than any other major technology in history. And in terms of the breadth of its use, those companies have been using AI for years in various functions, fraud detection and market analytics and things like that. You can see in this chart from it's based on McKinsey data that the growth in that use had kind of stagnated. And then you had the arrival of ChatGPT, which was almost exactly 3 years ago. And the use of AI in companies has just shot up. These numbers are as of the summer, so no doubt the use levels are even higher now. And I think one of the things for issues for cybersecurity considerations that really almost every company is using generative AI now, even if they're not intentionally using it, because their employees are using it, and that creates the risks of shadow AI that we can talk about in a bit. So the potential risks are quite far and wide, and as you said, they're not just the risks that are applicable to the makers of this technology themselves.
Got it. So Rex, given the widespread issues here and how quickly they're changing, how can leaders even begin to wrap their arms around the potential exposure to cyber risk at their organization?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple ways that leaders can approach it. Number one is to exercise a little bit of caution. Pump the brakes just a little bit. Look, AI and the promise of AI is tremendous, and I think we're seeing some of that promise be realized already, and it's exciting and it drives the enthusiasm for AI. But AI also comes with some risks, and so we don't want to unnecessarily adopt those risks, through that kind of unbridled, enthusiasm for the promise of AI. So with that in mind, I think there's a couple of different ways that you can look at it, and we use a kind of a three-dimensional model for uh, when we try to find AI-based capabilities that we think hold some promise for our business. So one, we talk about where it sits, and by that I mean, is this a kind of a user interface? Is it an enterprise capability? Or for us at least, does it exist within our product? And each one of those dimensions comes with its own kind of risk category. We look at what it accesses. At the end of the day, a lot of the kind of the risk profile of AI is based on the sensitivity of data that it's going to access. If we're talking about somebody who's using it to write better emails, probably pretty low access or pretty low risk. I'm not too worried about that. But if we're talking about healthcare information or compensation information for our employees, stuff like that's really very sensitive, very high risk, and we're going to want to put a lot of controls around it. And then finally, with the rise of agentic AI, and this is AI that's able to take action, potentially without a human in the loop. With the rise of agentic AI, that third dimension that we look at is what can it do? So again, right now, a lot of people are using AI from a generative AI perspective, like think ChatGPT. You go, either you communicate with an AI chatbot, you get some results back, maybe you give it some data, it analyzes it, gives you results. But with agentic AI, you're talking about AI that's able to take action on your behalf or on your organization's behalf. That potentially carries a lot more risk. So when we look at that three-dimensional model, we're able to determine what is the potential ROI versus what is the risk that we're encountering.
Mm-hmm. In your dealings with all these organizations that you work with, is your sense that leaders of these organizations have a good understanding of where their organizations touch AI? Is everyone sort of auditing their use, or is this an area that maybe people need to start paying more attention to?
It's definitely a scenario where people need to start paying more attention. Look, there's a lot, like we said, a lot of enthusiasm for AI. There's a very strong demand signal at kind of all levels of seniority throughout an organization. In talking to my peers, this is something that we see throughout a wide variety of industries where people are hearing stories depending, anecdotal perhaps, maybe partially true sometimes, but they're hearing stories about the efficiencies of AI and the benefits of AI, and nobody wants to be left behind. Everyone's looking at their competition and trying to figure out how are they using AI to their benefit, and how do we make sure that we're not missing out on that advantage. There's value in that, and it helps push us in really interesting directions, but it also has the potential to push organizations that aren't sufficiently thoughtful about this in kind of the path of danger. So definitely we want leaders to be very cognizant, very aware of how they approach their AI adoption strategy.
Gotcha. Jason, in your report, you found that AI can execute cyber attacks that can exceed anything that a human can defend against because of the sheer speed and scale of what AI can do. Talk about what that threat looks like.
Yeah, we're starting to see evidence that attackers can use AI to automate aspects of attacks in ways that can make them much faster and easier to scale. AI is still very imperfect; its capabilities are limited, but it's good at certain things in its own way. It's kind of creative. It can guess at a lot of probable tactics to say exploit vulnerabilities in software. And so if you're able to develop and refine a set of instructions for AI agents to deploy them in an attack, there's evidence that they can replicate tactical variations very quickly, really faster than humans are going to be able to respond to. So, cybersecurity has always been an arms race, and there's the potential for this to sort of supercharge that.
All right. Rex, give us an example of a worst case scenario that AI enables.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, there's a term in our industry, within the cybersecurity industry, called fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And there's a lot of it for our domain. We're domain based on conflict. Um, from an AI perspective, there's tremendous potential for frankly bad things to happen, and we typically bucket those into two categories. One is intentional, where we're talking about a malicious kind of actor or adversary using AI to accelerate their actions, like Jason described, and just move at a speed and efficiency that defenders can't counter against. And if we think to some of the activities of, let's say, kind of Russia and the Ukraine, and where they've taken action against critical infrastructure, before and during the invasion of that country, that was done without the benefit of AI, and it still moved fast enough where defenders were overloaded and unable to kind of defend effectively against those attacks. You overlay AI on top of that speed, that efficiency, that ability to find vulnerabilities that are unknown to the defenders. You're going to be overwhelmed really, really quickly. Um, but look, that's from a technology perspective. Frankly, and this transcends technology. AI is that it has a potential to introduce kind of a post-truth element to society writ large. Its ability to develop kind of very convincing, but fraudulent images, videos, audio. This is something that we train our people on, from a corporate perspective, to make sure that they're detecting, potentially fraudulent applicants, or phishing emails, or voicemails that purport to come from our CEO but are actually an attacker. So we train our people on that, but society in general is pretty vulnerable to that as well.
We have a question in the chat asking if it would be possible to provide the link to the reports that we're discussing, and we will do that in the post-event email. You'll get an email from us with some key takeaways and links to both of Jason's reports. So thank you for that question. And someone else is saying the chat is disabled. Assume you meant to say submit questions through the Q&A. Yes, that's what I meant to say. Thank you. So Jason, talk a little bit more about some of these threats. Rex has mentioned fraud, enhanced phishing. Another area of vulnerability is the shadow AI that you mentioned earlier. Can you talk a little bit about that and the issues it creates?
Yeah, I think, again, it's difficult for companies to know for sure what their employees are using. And there's the sort of the risk of inadvertent breaches where employees are plugging company data into models that are not, ring fenced the way that if you do a corporate deal with these companies, your data is supposed to be walled off. But if you're using the personal versions, they aren't necessarily. In fact, sometimes if you don't do the settings right, they can be publicly posted depending on which model you're using. So it just gets to the point that Rex was mentioning earlier. You really have to make sure that you are clear on what the employees are using, and especially when it's people are in a position of access to sensitive data.
Mm-hmm. And you also wrote about how attackers can manipulate AI models themselves through tactics like data poisoning. How does that work?
This is really fascinating. I mean, AI, chat is so sophisticated sometimes in its language. We can think of it as being very smart. It's incredibly credulous in terms of the data that it ingests. So data poisoning is when you can sneak manipulative instructions into large language models by inserting them in the training data. And the training data can be stuff that's on the web. And the models are very bad at judging truth from falsehood and good information from bad. So there have been studies that have shown that a relatively small number of documents, there was one in particular recently that Anthropic did with some British researchers that showed that even with a sizable model, you only needed to have like 250 documents within the training data in order for the model to be vulnerable to the insertion of, say, what are called backdoors. So you can put instructions in the training data that will say leak at company's internal information if the LLM receives a certain prompt. Or you could put instructions, you could plant documents in training data for a bank's fraud detection system that label examples of genuinely fraudulent behavior as legitimate, so the model gets confused. And so the idea is that with a relatively small amount of data, you can trick these models into behaving badly. There was another study just last month that showed that you could manipulate LLMs to violate their own safety protocols just by putting malicious prompts into the form of poetry. So poetry was confusing the models in ways that people hadn't realized was possible.
That's amazing. Well, that leads to an audience question that we have. How vulnerable, and I'll send this to you, Rex, how vulnerable are the AI services of the market dominant companies, OpenAI, Microsoft, Anthropic, Google, et cetera?
So the good news is that the vulnerabilities, we're in an improving state. The companies that are putting out the major models are, taking security seriously. And if you had asked that question, maybe, 10, 18 months ago, it would have been a different answer. But now I think, we're generally seeing an adherence to best coding principles, to making sure that, the models aren't able to be, quite as easily manipulated. Although I guess poetry, who can resist poetry? But
Certainly not an AI.
yeah, who knew, right? So look, we're in a better state than we were, 6 months ago, 10 months ago. But that said, if you take a model and you drop it into an environment that doesn't have a sufficient amount of kind of access controls and data controls in place, it is going to act in a way that you don't want it to. So AI has the potential to make a good environment, a secure environment, much better. But it also has the potential to take a bad and poorly managed environment and make it much worse. So you really have to be confident about the status of where you're dropping the AI model, where you're dropping these AI capabilities, and make sure that you're dropping it into an already secure environment so that it doesn't inadvertently exploit some of the vulnerabilities that already exist.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And we're getting a lot of questions about solutions, and we're about to move there. But I did just want to ask, Jason, we've talked about those studies that the AI companies are doing, but what about real life examples where an organization or a company has already faced an AI enabled attack? Did any stand out to you in your research?
Yeah, I think, and Rex alluded to this category earlier, the use of the AIs to enhance phishing attacks and with deepfakes, that has already been happening. I mean, the ability to make very convincing videos using actual, footage of real people, including the executives in a company. There was a notorious incident involving a construction design company called Arup last year, in which employees supposedly attended a fake virtual meeting with executives who instructed the employee to send money to a certain place, and they did. Questions about how protocols could have allowed that, but still, that type of thing, very sophisticated, personalized phishing attacks. So we all get the emails and the texts that are sort of generic, but you can now automate like personalized attacks that can be very directed at an individual and therefore much more likely to make them, fall into the trap of doing what the attackers want.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's talk a little bit about the other side of the coin, AI and solutions to cybersecurity. Jason, you published a report this week looking at solutions, specifically at how AI itself can be used to defend against AI threats. So talk a little bit about how AI can change the game for defense, not only offense.
Yeah, there's a few ways, and it's genuinely pretty exciting. I think one that is still nascent but generating a lot of excitement is using AI to review software to find vulnerabilities and suggest fixes. So there are a lot of flaws in software that fall into widely known categories of flaws. Like we know these types of problems exist, and yet they are still present in many pieces of software. And AI has proven to be quite good already at discovering these and then suggesting fixes to speed up the process of mending those holes. So that's a large swath of attacks is just that kind of thing. If you can automate that sort of bug hunting, you can also potentially catch many more of the vulnerabilities in software before it is even shipped. So that could really tilt the balance in favor of the good guys. And I mentioned earlier, Jen Easterly, that's what she's very excited about. She said our problem has not really been a cybersecurity problem. It's been a software quality problem. And you have the potential to fix that, as well as using AI to fix old code. There's a lot of legacy code out there in the marketplace that can be repaired. So that's one big way that's showing promise. Another is automating the security operations centers, or SOCs, that companies use. They're constantly monitoring threats and vulnerabilities and different signals, many of which are benign, but they have to judge which is which. And there was a study in October by the Cloud Security Alliance that found that AI-assisted SOCs were much more accurate and faster, more efficient, completing tasks in roughly half the time of teams that were not using AI. So there are a couple of very promising areas.
Well, Rex, I had asked you earlier to paint a worst case scenario. What is the best case scenario of how AI can empower cyber defense from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people look at AI as kind of almost an independent solution where it goes off and it does its own thing, and it accomplishes wonderful kind of tasks and goals. I think the most important aspect of AI is that it augments the human, the existing human. And we've seen some variation in terms of the marketplace and how they address the intersection of humans and AI from a defensive perspective. We've seen companies, talk about laying off large portions of their workforce because they think that the entry level positions are no longer needed. It's going to be replaced by AI. I think the smarter approach that I've seen is leveraging AI to augment existing capabilities within your workforce, existing people within your workforce, and letting them be more efficient, more effective, and actually, Jason's point about the kind of the SOC analyst. That is a very high turnover role. You typically see people roll out of that within a couple years because it is a grueling and sometimes thankless task. By leveraging AI, enabling them to get rid of some of the more mundane and rote activities within their portfolio and letting them focus on some of the activities that require a bit more human cognition. It makes the role more enjoyable, more fulfilling. It keeps them there longer, and that knowledge retention for an organization is really, really valuable. So I think there's tremendous value in exploiting, or leveraging that intersection of AI and the human in an augmented way.
So Rex, let's get tactical. So we have these expanded threats and these expanded capabilities. Where would you recommend an executive or organizational leader start to effectively protect their organization? Like, walk us through, if they came to you for advice, how you would get them started.
Yeah. So, so look, I think ultimately you start with start with a policy, which sounds maybe boring, but that's absolutely where you need to start. You need to have some sort of well thought out approach to how you want to use AI and what the kind of boundaries for its use within your organization are. When ChatGPT hit the screen, almost 3 years ago exactly, a lot of us were caught flat-footed. Very few people had existing AI policies, and everyone was scrambling to figure out what does this mean, and how do I kind of approach this, from an organizational perspective. So starting from a policy perspective, understanding like what your comfort levels are, what your boundaries are, absolutely essential. From there, you start looking at your existing kind of tech portfolio, and your business portfolio, right? And what are your business functions? How can you smartly apply AI to gain efficiencies and effectiveness, with minimal risk? Start with those areas where you think you're going to have highest reward versus minimal risk, and run through those doors. Use those as test case kind of scenarios to determine, hey, look, are we good at this AI thing? Do we need some improvements? Do we need to bring in outside expertise to help us figure this out? There's a lot of different ways in which you can kind of approach this in a gentle way, but still get some quick and early wins.
Mm-hmm. And Jason, your reports have actionable recommendations for executives. Can you give us a few recommendations that you make?
Yeah, I mean, those are a couple of really good ones from Rex. I'd say, maybe first, just a mindset issue. I think companies need to look at this as pretty urgent. And I don't say that as somebody who believes that AI is infallible or unflawed. Its capabilities are still limited. But I think if you look at what all of the big companies are doing in terms of this techniques of finding of developing tools to use AI to find code vulnerabilities that I was talking about earlier. They're using them to fix the code. The bad guys can use that to find vulnerabilities to exploit, and that gets to the sort of automated, fast and wide scope attacks that I was talking about earlier. So if you have those vulnerabilities, if anything you haven't done yet, and you've kind of been getting by on luck, the chances of that continuing to work are diminishing. I think you really have to make sure that you are handling the basics, that you have an AI governance policy, as Rex was saying, that you're inventorying all of the ways that your employees are using this technology, so there aren't any sort of back doors you're unaware of. I think another thing that employees can do, the companies rather can do, and institutions, is to start demanding what is called secure by design software. So, there's just a lot of the software that's out there. The industry has prioritized sort of getting out features and products quickly and competitively at low cost. And as we develop these abilities to have software that is mended before it reaches the market, companies should start demanding that. They should start to ask whether it's been vetted by these AI tools, and use some of their, particularly bigger companies, use some of their purchasing power to demand more from the software industry, so that the software is less vulnerable before they even start using it.
Well, that leads me to one of the many excellent questions that we're getting in the Q&A. I'll send this one to you, Rex. Third-party risk management best practices for evaluating vendor security controls where a vendor's tool may have AI functionality and capability. So how do you deal with your vendors?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's something that comes up in every kind of peer group conversation that I have with folks in my position. So look, there's a couple challenges there. One, and first and foremost, is gaining the visibility into your tech stack and the exposure of AI within that tech stack. That is not only just for your existing tech stack, but also kind of going forward from a procurement perspective. Um, you know, Additionally, one of the challenges is that like when you do have that kind of better visibility, you have to figure out what the kind of organizational and procedural triggers are for a review of AI within your tech stack. So you do it during the procurement process. If so, that's great, but you might be missing things that aren't going through procurement, but are getting updated with AI capabilities, just as part of their normal life cycle. And so you need to make sure that you're kind of managing the visibility into that. And then finally, you need to build kind of a reasonable coalition within your organization of, not only, cyber and IT, but also bring in the procurement team, bring in the legal team, and then bring in your business partners to make sure that, all those organizational units are collaborating on figuring out what is the organizational risk tolerance, versus what are the AI capabilities that are coming in, through these vendors. Some vendors, they have capabilities that are tremendously interesting, but are implemented in ways that are potentially very risky, or that in ways that maybe don't respect the security of your data, right? And they bring their data back, they train their models on it, things like that. You got to be really careful and in all these different dimensions when you're evaluating how you move forward in this AI augmentation of your existing technology.
So Rex, you just mentioned data. We have a data question on data privacy and AI. How do you protect sensitive data from being leaked or exposed when leveraging AI tools from within an organization?
It's a really good question. I mentioned 3 years ago, ChatGPT kind of hit the global zeitgeist, and everyone's scrambling to figure out, how do we deal with this? The first thing that we did, like I mentioned, is create a policy, and at that time, the policy was, relatively straightforward, with an emphasis on kind of, speed, at that moment. Our rules were, don't upload sensitive data into a third party AI capability. Don't trust what comes out of it. And if you are going to make use of what comes out of it, you have to scrub it for kind of other people's intellectual property or kind of reasonableness, things like that. So that first element, like don't upload sensitive data into a third party AI capability, remains true today. It's no less relevant. Now, look, if you're talking about an AI capability that's built into part of your tech stack, if you're talking about using a model that you've brought in as an enterprise solution, there are ways in which you can use those with sensitive data, but you have to be cautious. And I'll give maybe a reasonable example. If you're bringing in an enterprise AI capability, like I don't know, like say a Gemini or something like that, and you're applying it to an existing kind of data source, is going to inherit the permissions and access controls and capabilities of that data source. And so suddenly, if you've got a bunch of people using Gemini, using that AI capability to access like I don't know, sales data, right? Well, if that original source isn't properly segmented, doesn't effectively control who can see what, um, the AI is going to supercharge that lack of controls. And so you really need to be cautious and be very, very confident that whatever you're applying that AI capability to already has the type of controls, the data segmentation, the data security in place before you make it available to your users.
So we have another question for you, Rex. When an organization plans to use agentic AI, what are the best practices to put limitations on what the agent can do? Sorry, it continues. So that it doesn't exceed what its objectives are. We don't want agents running
Yeah,
rampant.
yeah, we do not. That's a really good question. There is not a. I'm not sure that there is an elegant solution to that, or at least a foolproof one. I think the best overarching philosophy that I've seen in practice is just kind of what I would characterize as a micro-segmentation of the agent, so that what you don't have is a single agent that has a tremendous amount of access and capabilities and direction to do a very broad set of things, and that instead what you have is a series of smaller agents that have discrete tasks that they work in concert with one another. But what that does is it prevents any one of them from really going off the rails in a material way. And they kind of, they error check each other and keep each other a little bit more secure. It's not foolproof, and you still need to have other controls kind of surrounding it. And again, that data security layer that exists outside of the AI capability is really important, but that segmentation is going to be key.
That's fascinating. So one more question along these lines that was pre-submitted before the briefing. How do you effectively approach AI through the lens of governance, risk, and compliance? You've talked a little bit about each of these, but just kind of give us the overarching view.
Yeah, and I think that really gets back to that coalition that building that I talked about earlier. That when we look at our GRC function, governance, risk, compliance, and we look at the AI component, there's a lot of collaboration that we have going on with our legal team, with our procurement team, and then with our kind of enablement and implementation functions like IT and business functions throughout our organization. Um, what we try not to do is make AI um, too unique or too precious. When it comes to our GRC functions and our kind of management of it overall. Yes, it is a new and exciting layer. It is very intriguing and it's sometimes like very burdensome as well. But ultimately, like we want the same thing out of AI that we want out of all of our existing tech. Which is a reasonable set of functionality, good ROI, and security, for kind of our data and functions. And so, what we haven't done is created a necessarily like an AI unique, pipeline, but we've tried to integrate it into our existing GRC functions.
Gotcha. Before we move on to the public policy piece of this discussion, Jason, I want to just talk for a moment about industry. You're joining us from Silicon Valley, where you're based, and you've been writing about how the tech and cyber industries are very quickly reshaping themselves as a result of these new emerging capabilities. Just explain what's happening to the industry.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot happening in this area. So we've seen a lot of deal making. For example, Palo Alto Networks, which is, I think, the biggest cyber company by market value, completed one acquisition of an AI-focused security company in July. And then like days later, they announced another one that was like $26 billion. Many of the biggest AI companies, including Google and OpenAI and Anthropic and Microsoft, are developing AI systems for that sort of bug hunting and fixing function that I was talking about earlier. And I think we will start to see actual products launch from those companies in the coming year. There's a lot of new startups in this area. I wrote about one of them called Corridor that is focused on working with the AI coding tool companies like Cursor to make sure that AI produced code is not producing vulnerabilities in software. We're also seeing work by the Pentagon's DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which, for example, in August concluded a 2-year contest among academic groups and companies to do this sort of software fixing work. So I think there's a lot of activity in this area across the industry.
No, that's fascinating. Well, let's talk a little bit about the public policy piece here. In your report, Jason, you wrote that the federal government is really taking a backseat role. So tell us a little bit more about what the current administration has done or said about cybersecurity. I mean, it put out this whole AI action plan. How is it thinking about the cyber piece of it?
Yeah, I mean, so, first of all, I think people are probably aware the general mode of this administration is that the top priority is to encourage the development of AI and really avoid doing things that could restrict that development of US AI and its dominance in the global industry. And I think there's also a preference for industry-driven solutions. And the AI czar, David Sachs, has publicly said he thinks that the private sector is best at dealing with this issue. He said in a couple of months ago, the threat of AI-driven cyber attacks is frequently cited as justification for AI safety legislation, but the private sector is already innovating with robust categories of AI cyber defense that will address the problem better than the government can. That's not to say that there's no attention to it. The Pentagon, of course, and national security agencies are doing a lot on this. The AI Action Plan did include several recommendations, among the more than 100 total, on strengthening cybersecurity. I think implementation so far, and it's only been 5 months, but has been limited, and there have been steps backwards. So we still do not have a head of CISA. The nomination that Trump put in has not been approved by the Republican-controlled Senate. So that agency is now being run by the acting head, the deputy, and the administration has slashed CISA's budget. There is a new national cyber director as of August, finally. Sean Carencross was finally seated, but notably, unlike his predecessors, and that job has not been around that long. You mentioned earlier that Rex helped to stand that institution up. Unlike his predecessors, he did not really have a background in technology or national security. It's more in politics. So I think there's been attention to it, but the level of action and implementation so far has been pretty limited at the federal level.
Rex, given your experience in federal government and policy, where do you think the federal government could be most useful or helpful in this moment?
Yeah. So like Jason said, we've really, witnessed a bit of a hands-off approach, and not even just a hands-off approach, like an active, kind of dissuasion from any sort of regulation. There are elements of the One Big Beautiful Bill and the NDAA that have had lines in them that have basically, said states shall not regulate AI. Now, of course, states have already started to regulate AI. Which has created an odd kind of dynamic, between the federal and the state levels, and then interstate, focuses on AI range from something like Colorado that has had a reasonably comprehensive AI bill that addresses it in a variety of different dimensions, to relatively single dimensional bills at other states that are focused on making sure that AI powered robots aren't are not able to stalk people. Maybe that's important, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't give industry or individuals an easily digestible kind of single format for AI regulation. if you extrapolate beyond this, beyond our borders to Europe, to Asia, there's an emerging body of regulation there as well. Europe, as usual, kind of taking the lead, with their EU AI Act. But others also, have been, leaders in establishing AI-based regulation. The challenge now is that, there is this increasing amount of disharmony, internationally from a regulatory perspective. That's not unusual for tech, but we are in the very early stages of a very dynamic capability that's emerging, from AI. That disharmonization is only going to get worse, and it makes it really hard for businesses that operate internationally to predict and comply with all of these regulations. Federal government could take steps to help kind of unify and minimize that disharmony, but to Jason's point, I'm not sure that there's an appetite for that right now.
Well, one thing you mentioned, Jason, in one of your reports was, we've talked a lot about the corporate setting, and Rex is talking about what he does with his clients. But you mentioned that at some of the entities, in society that most need help with their cybersecurity maybe are not the ones best placed to invest in it, like some of our critical infrastructure. Can you talk about that for a minute and what AI means for them?
Yeah, and Rex may have thoughts on that too, having worked at CISA. But yeah, I think it isn't necessarily a lack of concern or awareness even, but a lot of these institutions that can least afford to have downtime, so hospitals, which don't close, for example, critical infrastructure institutions, often are the slowest to take action on known fixes. So, operating systems, we all know this from our phones, right? We get regular updates and you're supposed to follow through on the updates because they include security patches. If you don't do that, those security patches, which are at that point known, could be used to exploit your device. And a lot of times these institutions will be the slowest because they're worried that implementing those patches, those fixes could cause disruptions themselves in their systems. So they take weeks, even months sometimes, and that's a period where they're hyper vulnerable. AI is not really fixing that problem except in the sense that building software that has fewer vulnerabilities before it goes out. But that is, I think, a constant struggle for people in this area is just ensuring that the fixes that are known to the problems that have been discovered are actually put into place.
Rex, when you look outside sort of your immediate client set more broadly across society, are there any particular corners that worry you most?
Yeah, absolutely. So, to Jason's point, when I was at CISA, we published what are known as a list of national critical functions. And this is about 50 or so kind of functions that society needs in order to effectively operate. When you look at that list and you kind of put it on a scale of who invests the most in cybersecurity, the amount of investment is almost it's concerningly inversely proportional to how critical that function is to life. And so I think at one end of the scale you have the finance sector, which obviously very important sector to modern society. Not discounting it at all, but they have a tremendous amount of investment in cybersecurity. They are absolutely leaders in that regard. On the other end of the scale, you have something like the water sector. Look, at the end of the day, we can probably go without, access to our banks for like a day or two. Water, if you go without water for about 24 hours, you're in a world of hurt. So we have a wide range of utilities that are kind of grossly underfunded and unable to invest in cybersecurity in a meaningful way. The only thing that's keeping us safe from a water utility perspective and from various other utilities across the nation is the fact that they are highly dispersed, and they're unable to be kind of attacked at scale. So thankfully we've got that going for us, but that's not going to continue to solve our problems in an age of AI when attackers are able to upgrade their speed and their scale of attacks at exponential amounts.
Mhm. Another question in the chat, what about small and medium enterprises, SMEs? How can they ensure cybersecurity when they have lean or no cyber resources and not much money available for outside expertise? What would you suggest?
Yeah, it's a good question. And so look, the thing about cybersecurity is that it is an environment in which we all kind of sink or swim together. As individuals, as organizations, large and small, we are all kind of players on a global battlefield, whether we like it or not. And so the kind of unifying ethos across the cybersecurity industry is reflects that. And there are a lot of different professional organizations that are dedicated to making sure that the talent and the capabilities and the resources that are available to some of those concentrated areas of more well-funded industry are spread out to medium size enterprises, to individuals as well. And so you have to hunt for them. They're not going to find you, but they're out there. So if you go to like an organization like OWASP, which is the Open Web Application Security Project, they have a tremendous amount of resources focused on AI and AI security that you can leverage. Free tools, guidebooks, playbooks that you can take and just drop into your environment. There's a lot that's out there, and you just have to leverage that kind of helping mentality that the cybersecurity industry tends to have.
That's fantastic. So I think what I'd like to do is get that link from you, and we'll put it in the
Yeah.
document that we send out as well. And we did have another audience question that you sort of answered, which was, I know I need to make my password more complicated and not share it with others, but what does the average person on the street do about AI and cybersecurity? So definitely checking out these resources. Is there anything you would add there?
Yeah, look, beyond the resources, I would just say exercise a healthy dose of skepticism. Like, we don't want you to be paranoid. That's the practitioner's job, I guess. But do be skeptical about how you use AI and just be cautious. Don't put in sensitive information into anywhere that you don't control. I think that'll generally keep you safe.
Great. Well, in all of our briefings, we like to look ahead and give our audience a sense of what's coming up. So, starting with you, Jason, what are you working on next for our subscribers?
Looking again at an area of AI and how it is supercharging what's known as digital twins or virtual twins. So this is technology that enables companies to build virtual versions of factories or logistics facilities or even stores, and use that to both design them more efficiently and also to manage them and deal with issues like maintenance more efficiently, and prevent downtime. So it's a fascinating area and application of AI to really enhance something that industry's been using for decades.
Well, I'm looking forward to that report. Rex, how about you? What are you working on next, and what do you want people to have on their radar?
Yeah, so look, for me, my daily existence is constantly balancing the needs of the business and the balance of security being baked into achieving those needs. We try to be an enablement function. Sometimes we're viewed as that. Sometimes we're seen as kind of an unnecessary break on progress. But we're constantly fighting to seek that balance. I think from an AI perspective, what I'm really looking forward to is seeing how AI improves the kind of the lives of ordinary people going forward. There's a sense of this moment that we're all waiting for, that AI will have this kind of tremendous impact, a transformational impact on society, and that may happen, but I think in smaller, more kind of marginal ways, we're going to be able to see real meaningful impacts for individuals, people that have maybe some disabilities, that they're able to leverage AI in ways that enable them to be more easily kind of participate in society in a fuller way. I think that's really, really exciting, and I'd love to be a part of that.
That's really cool. Well, staying on this theme of looking ahead over the horizon, we have an audience question that just says, what about quantum computing and AI? So help us see the next issue here.
Yeah, so look, quantum computing, the one thing that I'll point out to everyone is that for a while, the NCSC, which is the UK's cyber agency, and then CISA, which is the US cyber agency, had guidance that said, hey, be on the lookout for quantum computing, be ready for it in about 10 years. And then recently that guidance changed to, hey, maybe you should be ready for it sooner rather than later. So, look, I've been on the inside of government. I've had to release reports that tried to say something without saying anything that I wasn't allowed to say. And I have no special knowledge on those reports, but I try to read the tea leaves on such things. I think we should all be looking for quantum sooner rather than later.
Mm-hmm. Is that what you're hearing as well, Jason, in your talks with industry?
Yeah, I mean, to Rex's point, like I think historically that's been the always 10 years out technology for a while, and I think there's been just in the last year or two some really meaningful progress by the big companies, Microsoft, Google, and others that are investing heavily in that. I think the potential for that to take everything we've just been talking about with the changes that AI is bringing cybersecurity and make the exponential even more exponential. I mean, just the amount of computing power that you'd be talking about combined with AI technology, the ability to use that for both nefarious and defensive purposes is pretty awesome to think about. So we're not there yet, and it could still be several years at least, but it's definitely getting closer.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Jason and Rex, for joining us. This is obviously an issue that we will continue to cover very closely at WP Intelligence. I'd like to remind our live audience that you can request a WP Intelligence platform demo by clicking the link on your screen. And please block your calendars for Fridays at 11 a.m. Eastern. This is our regular intelligence briefing slot. I will be back next Friday with our new lead analyst for healthcare, Rebecca Adams, and we'll be talking about how AI is transforming healthcare, and specifically how the federal government is inviting venture capital and startups to remake rural healthcare in particular, as well as changes that are coming to Medicare and reimbursement and payments. This is a huge, huge transformation in the healthcare system that the administration is trying to implement. So please join us for that conversation next Friday. And in the meantime, have a wonderful weekend.